Chapter 5, Evolution, Biodiversity, and Population Ecology. The central case for this chapter is the golden toads of Monteverde. And we don't really need to know that much about the case study for your exam. Turning the next page, starting here, under this topic, Evolution as the Wellspring of Earth's Biodiversity, you need to know the chart, the natural selection chart here, and these principles of natural selection. Natural selection is basically survival of the fittest. If you have the best adaptations for survival, you will survive. And this lists it out for you, that first of all, organisms produce more offspring than can survive, that organisms vary in their characteristics, that some are inherited, and so therefore some are better suited to their environment, and the ones that are better suited, we say they're fitter, the ones that will survive and reproduce and pass on their better genes. That's the basic process of natural selection. Up at the top of the page, this, by the way, is page 119 if you have a textbook. If you're reading online, then again it's section Evolution as the Wellspring of Earth's Biodiversity. On this page we have a couple of topics. We have selected for and selected against. So you need to know that selected for is a good trait, which means that this organism survives and passes on their good trait. If their trait is selected against, it's a bad trait. We sometimes call it a maladaptive trait. For example, if you are a giraffe and you need to reach the leaves of the acacia tree, which are very tall, and you have a very long neck, long necks are selected for, whereas short necks are selected against. Short necks is a maladaptive trait. Turning the page, we have types of selection here. Make sure that you know the different types of selection: directional, stabilizing, and disruptive. So read about those and make sure you know those for your exam. That's on page 120. Turning the next page, we have here a couple of examples of artificial selection, which is also called selective breeding. This is on page 122. Some examples are crops and livestock. We've done this for thousands of years. We've breeded together traits that are good, that we like in crops together. Or, for example, the dog example, we've bred and created new breeds of dogs for the traits that we like. Also, you need to know the definition of biodiversity, which is the number of species in an area. We estimate that we have 100 million species on this planet. Moving over to the next page, 123, we have an example of speciation. This is an example of allopatric speciation, which is also geographic speciation. And so what happens in this example is you have here a squirrel that is a medium brown color, and this population of squirrels gets flooded, and now you have two separate populations of squirrels. And on this island, lighter fur is selected for, and on this island, darker fur is selected for. Perhaps this one has more shade, and darker fur can hide better in shade. Perhaps this one, lighter fur, is for a more dry environment. It blends better. And then down here, if the waters recede, and now these two populations can breed with each other, but they don't anymore. So they can mingle, but they no longer breed with each other. We would say that they are now separate species. And so that's how geographic isolation can lead to speciation. Turning the page, we have some examples of ways that allopatric speciation can occur. Note 2 to 3 from this chart. You need to also know about sympatric speciation. This happens mainly in plants through asexual reproduction. What happens is that a plant can create a mutation. If you have a mutation and you can no longer breed with others of your kind, for an animal, you would die out because you couldn't pass on that mutation because you couldn't breed with others of your own species. For a plant that can reproduce asexually through budding or vegetative growth or sends out a runner of some kind, then you can create clones of yourself and then later on produce flowers with the clones and sexually reproduce that way, and so you can create a new species like that. There's other examples in your book about sympatric speciation as well. On the next page we have phylogenetic trees. We do not need to know anything about phylogenetic trees. Alright, going on to page 126, starting here. You don't have to know about any of the other stuff. So start here. You need to understand what an endemic species is. So this is page 127. This is, if you're online, it's under some species are more vulnerable to extinction than others. Endemic means found only one place on Earth. The example in the book is the Yosemite toad. It's only found in the Sierra Nevada mountains. An example out here in Santa Clarita is the unarmored three-spined stickleback fish. It's only found in our river, the Santa Clara River, and that's all. Going back to endemic. Endemic species are more vulnerable to extinction because if that habitat is altered, there's no other place for this species to live, and so it dies out more quickly. Make sure you understand from this page, page 128, that there have been 5 previous mass extinctions in the world, and we are currently experiencing our 6th mass extinction, mostly caused from habitat destruction by humans. Going on to levels of ecological organization. This is page 130. Make sure you know the chart and the definitions of the chart. Students often get confused between population, community, and ecosystem, so make sure that you know the difference between those 3, and they're pretty clear in the book. Just make sure that you review this. On the next page, under population ecology, or actually before that, the book talks about a generalist species versus a specialist species. This is on page 131. A generalist is a species that can live in lots of different places, lots of ecosystems, and can eat a variety of different foods. The coyote's like that. A specialist lives pretty much in one ecosystem and only eats limited types of food. The polar bear is like this. It can only live in the tundra, and it hunts off of the ice, and it hunts specific food like seals. So if its habitat changes, it's more vulnerable to extinction. So again, a specialist is more likely to become endangered or extinct. So now we move, and these 2 sticky notes are really from this part of the page. Moving on to population ecology and turning the page. Page 132, if you have your book, shows a picture of the passenger pigeon. And the passenger pigeon was once abundant, now it's extinct. So it's an example of a species that has declined. On page 133, make sure you know the different types of population distribution: random, uniform, and clumped. On page 134, we have some age population pyramids. You do not need to really know about these at this time. We'll review these more in chapter 8. Page 135, we have here survivorship curves, this chart, and this is an important chart. We have type 1, this is on page 135. Type 1 is humans example. You live when you're young, you die when you're old. So the death rate is low. And here it's the number of survivors is very high when you're young, and then you die off when you're old. We are type 1. We don't have much death when you're young. Birds, it's the same death rate, young or old. And then for type 3, high death rate when you're young, so number of survivors drops dramatically when you're young, but then when you're old, you live a long time. So example, think of a tadpole that turns into a frog. The tadpole, when a frog lays eggs, the frog lays hundreds of eggs, which hatch into dozens of tadpoles. And the tadpoles are prey to a lot of food. They get eaten, they get dried up, they die easily. But if a frog does make it from tadpole to a frog and an adult frog, it's going to live several years. And so the same thing with plants and trees. They're going to let out thousands of seeds, but only a couple of them are going to germinate into plants because the rest are eaten or they die. Page 136, we have exponential growth, and talks about unregulated populations increased by exponential growth. So when there's no limiting factors, when nothing stops population growth, we call it exponential growth. And we call it a J-curve because it kind of makes this slight J here, not a very large J, but a slight J. And read the caption here and understand the picture. It explains it very well. But this doesn't occur in nature very well. Really in nature, we have limiting factors, water, space, food, predators, and disease, that limit a population size. Make sure you know this picture. Make sure you know this caption. And so most populations experience logistic growth. And they will grow exponentially, but then get stuck at a certain level, and that's its carrying capacity, which is the number of organisms that an environment can support. And so we call this an S-curve because it's kind of this weird S shape right there. And we'll stop here and we'll continue with another video for part 2 of chapter 5.